Do you fear that Taiwan is going to go the way of Hong Kong?
If everything is about realpolitik, everything is about a deal, would the future of Taiwan be part of the deal?
Trump said that he gave no assurances either way what he was going to do about Taiwan. And of course, what does President Trump do on the way home? But he posts on social media, the Chinese have got a ballroom. No, we deserve our ballroom too.
I have to be more vigilant than ordinary people because there is a bounty on my head. I'm on the wanted list.
When you say there's a bounty on your head and they may be surveilling you, do you actually fear for your life? Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. What has Donald Trump got out of his two-day trip to Beijing? There are some roses from the Chinese president for the White House Rose Garden, apparently. But a trade deal, an end to the war in Iran, the Strait of Hormuz reopened, that all seemed rather more elusive. And what about Xi Jinping? Did he get to show that China is now America's equal on the global stage? Access to US tech and AI? Could he even have got the nod from Trump that Taiwan and its threatened democracy is now no longer a priority for the US? To discuss all this, I'm joined by Channel 4 News foreign affairs expert Jonathan Rugman and the Hong Kong democracy activist Nathan Law, who's now living in exile in the UK and on a Chinese wanted list. Nathan, first of all, when you see Trump coming out of this meeting, throwing praise at Xi Jinping and nothing very concrete about Taiwan and freedom, are you worried?
Well, of course, when you look at the results of the meeting, we don't see anything about human rights. You don't see anything about the issues that we've been really talking about, like the concentration camp in Xinjiang and Hong Kong stuff. Like, it seems like the democratic rights and human rights issues have been sort of like buried down all these talks about economy, talks about trade, and talks about business. I completely understand that there are certain really pressing issues that are happening around the world. That maybe China could be seen as someone who could break a deal or who could work on ease some of the situation. But as someone who is also paying attention to the situation of Hong Kong and the state of democracy around the world, that's definitely worrying sign that these things are not being addressed.
Jonathan, trade was the top priority here, but even there, we don't have a lot of big headlines out of this trip, do we?
No, we don't. The tariffs that Trump imposed on China last year at 145% have been reduced to 30%, but they're still there. And this was, at most, a fragile truce between the two most powerful men in the world who were sort of sizing each other up. And doing so for domestic consumption. The Chinese economy has slowed down. It's good for President Xi to be seen with President Trump. President Trump needs to deliver a Chinese purchase of American soybeans, a Chinese purchase of Boeing jets, things he can take back to America for American jobs, particularly with the midterm elections approaching. And so on the way home, President Trump has been talking up these things and saying they're buying hundreds of jets, they're going to buy billions of dollars worth of soybeans, and the Chinese have not confirmed that. So not for the first time, I don't think we can take Trump literally in terms of what he's saying. And the tensions between these two countries still very much exist.
I mean, when Nathan says, democracy and human rights have slipped down the agenda, the media talks a lot about democracy and human rights when there is a big diplomatic trip, whether it's Britain and China or America and China. In reality, how front and center are human rights questions when it comes to the American and Chinese relationship?
They've not vanished from the agenda, but they've diminished significantly. I mean, compare it with the first Trump presidency when Mike Pompeo was the US Secretary of State. He was really exercised about the plight of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. When did you last hear about the Uyghurs in Xinjiang as far as the Americans are concerned? It's not happening. And what has happened to US foreign policy is it's taken on this, what they would see as a pragmatic Realpolitik approach about great power rivalry, but also great power coexistence. That somehow, if you let the Chinese do what they want to do in their part of the world, then the Chinese will let us do what we want to do in our part of the
Trump's
world.
whole spheres of influence theory.
Yeah.
Nathan, what does that tell you? I mean, one of the things, a couple of months ago we were speculating about that might come out of this trip, for example, was Trump going to get Jimmy Lai, the Hong Kong businessman and democracy campaigner, out of jail? Britain had failed to do that, but Trump was the big hope. I spoke to Jimmy Lai's son, actually, and they were really hopeful that maybe something could come of this. It doesn't appear to have done.
When we talk about the situation of Hong Kong, I think many other issues has buried what has happening in Hong Kong. It is being cycled out of media, but things have been stagnated, things have been worsening, and there are still many political prisoners in Hong Kong, including Jimmy Lai, including Joshua Wong, who was just brought on court for a new charge being put on him to keep him in prison as long as possible. And when we think about China, they've been aggressive on South China Sea, they've been aggressive on all fronts in terms of trying to flex their muscle. But seemingly, if the theory is if bad actors, they behave in that way without much other consequences, they will continue to do so. And you can interpret the way that whatever the theory of Trump's atmosphere of a severe influence, or the way that it is only about trade, it is some sort of enabling of those behaviors. And we're seeing Jimmy Lai and Joshua Wong being in jail for probably decades. And one of them, Jimmy Lai, is 78-year-old, and his family is also really concerned about his health, whether he could walk out jail alive after 20 years of imprisonment. I
mean, the big question obviously is Taiwan. Do you fear that Taiwan is going to go the way of Hong Kong?
I think there are still big distinction compared to the political system, the influence of the PRC in these two places. But definitely, I also hear lots of concerns about the state of Taiwan from people who are in Taiwan and people who care about the issue, mainly because if everything is about realpolitik, everything is up for grabs, everything is about a deal, would the future of Taiwan be part of the deal if, let's say, the importance of the semiconductor industry and all other other things that matter to the U.S. economy dwindle? I think this is a real concern for the people who are living in the island.
I mean, what do we know about what they said about Taiwan, other than they talked about it a lot? And Xi, at least, suggested that if things go wrong in terms of the American relationship, it could lead to war.
Yes, I mean, the Chinese warned Trump off getting involved in Taiwan, and they said, it could lead to conflict. And I think if you're Taiwanese, you're probably a bit more worried today than you were yesterday, because President Trump on the plane on the way home said, we spoke a lot about Taiwan. It was clearly top of the agenda for the Chinese. It wasn't top of Trump's agenda. And Trump said that he gave no assurances either way what he was going to do about Taiwan. And he said he still hadn't determined and would determine in the next few days whether some $11 to $13 billion of military aid from America to Taiwan would go ahead. Now, this was something that the Trump White House agreed to do at the end of last year. And after this visit, President Trump goes home and says, well, I haven't decided whether it's going to go ahead or not. And so that will be very worrying for the Taiwanese, and it's no coincidence that they have launched rather aggressive-looking military exercises just to tell everybody, the Chinese and the Americans, that they are on their guard.
But the Chinese were surprisingly open, I thought, with their language.
Yes, they were.
In terms of the diplomatic readout, to talk about this could lead to conflict and war.
Yeah.
In the middle of a US diplomatic visit is quite a thing.
I think it's quite a thing because they intend to do it, to take Taiwan back. They're not doing it at the moment because they are currently Xi is conducting a purge of Chinese senior military officers. He may not have people he can trust, people who could carry out an operation like that. But what is really frightening, I think, for the rest of us is that the issue of Taiwan is a domestic issue for China. It is not an international issue. It is a stated intention. And what the rest of us think about it may not matter that much. One outcome of what's happened in the Strait of Hormuz with Iran is the Chinese will have been looking at that very, very closely and saying, well, what can we learn from this? This blockade has been a bit of a mess. How could we do things differently when it comes to Taiwan? And perhaps the global effect of that conflict, particularly on energy prices. Well, the Chinese were thinking, well, what happens if semiconductor chips that were going to leave Taiwan are now stopped? That's the equivalent to oil and gas in the Strait of Taiwan. So that's an interesting pause for thought as far as the Chinese are concerned.
And Xi talked about the Thucydides Trap, and Trump looked back at him as if he knew what that was. So what is it, and why was Xi talking about this?
Shall I give a very brief explanation? The Second Peloponnesian War, Thucydides, one of the world's first historians, wrote about it, the war between Athens and Sparta. And the parallel that Xi was trying to make was that it was a war between a rising power and an established power. And that what tended to happen in history was that an established power went to war with a rising power. And what Xi was trying to say was, don't repeat that mistake. Just because we are a rising power, don't assume that you should, go to war with us. It would not be a good idea. And I think, what's really worrying about this visit is it was so clearly dominant to everything that Xi was thinking about was Taiwan.
And revealing that Xi is really calling America a falling power.
Well, I think that is...
That's the implication, isn't it, of talking about the Thucydides Trap?
Or I think that there is an implication where all these Chinese rhetorics about China is a peaceful country, China wants to coexist, try to portray that they are the good guy, the benign guy, and the US is the evil guy and trying to do these expansionist effort and going to war with some others. But I think we just cannot take it as it is.
I mean, that is very much what the Chinese... I mean,
yes.
I went for the Starmer visit, and the sort of the briefing that you're getting from the sort of the Chinese think tanks, who brief Western journalists, is very much, we are now the peacemaker, the peacemaker and the protector of the international order. We believe in rules. We believe in the United Nations and the rules-based order. That is what they're trying to project.
Yeah, but if we sort of look back to what Xi Jinping has been doing for the past decades, they've built enormous efforts in Belt and Road projects. They've been trying to do a lot of cooptation in different countries. They've been trying to compete sort of on a global stage in terms of international influence with the US or US allies, and they've been doing a lot on Hong Kong and on Xinjiang Uyghurs and on Tibetans, just to establish its authority in a way to say that we are going to march forward with our authoritarianism, our sort of the way that we govern the country, and anyone who try to criticize us in terms of human rights, in terms of democratic rights, you're not going to make it, and we will sort of rebuild you with full force.
And that's quite attractive to President Trump. Strength. It was interesting watching the two leaders walk around the Imperial Garden in Beijing today, and President Xi pointing out these 500-year-old trees. And no embarrassment about a Communist Party leader using hundreds of years of empire as a backdrop to say to President Trump, we've been here a long time. We've had dynastic rulers before, and here is Xi, another one. And of course, what does President Trump do on the way home? But he posts on social media, the Chinese have got a ballroom. We deserve our ballroom too. It's a trick. It's a trick that so many countries are now playing with Trump, which is putting on a show of pomp and circumstance, and actually having him rather jealous of the power and the kind of pomp that other countries have, in the hope that feeds a kind of narrative for Trump that, we respect these people. They do what they do in their part of the world, and we do what we do in our part of the world.
What is the stated American position? I mean, diplomatically, the United States recognizes that Taiwan is part of China, but that it has a relationship with the Taiwanese people and government that involves trade and defense and all sorts of other things. But, I mean, is Trump basically saying that is up for grabs? the nature of that, that the US will have an independent relationship with Taiwan?
I think that is up for grabs. I think on the other side of it, President Xi is a man who craves predictability. And so how do you square the ambition to retake Taiwan, to incorporate it into China, with that supposed diplomatic, only adult in the room approach, which the Chinese like to portray themselves as? Are they actually prepared to do this thing? I've said that it's their stated policy that it should be, part of China. Whether Trump gets involved or not, I think is a very big question. I mean, you sort of ask yourself, well, would it be better to try and take Taiwan back while Trump is president than it would be to wait until after that? But as I said, I don't think the Chinese are ready to do it.
Well, I mean, in terms of the timetable, the fear has been that the Chinese would move around 2027, not necessarily with an invasion, but with the beginning of a blockade. What do you think is likely to happen?
I think we've had many timetables before. Like some said that 2025 was the perfect window, and some said that like 2027. I just agree with the idea that it is not ready yet. She has a lot of mess at home that he has to take care of, and I think for now, all the signs, all the signals are portraying they would rather have a quote unquote peaceful way of sorting it out by working with the people, enablers, and people who sympathize with the CCP inside Taiwan by trying to regain power through election, etc. So I would feel like definitely we have to be cautious, we have to be careful. Blockade, it is a theory, it is not something that China is actively planning. And I think this is something that we all should really be aware about.
How good do you think is Taiwan at wielding its own power? And the impact of war around Taiwan on semiconductors and the impact of that on the world?
In terms of the war itself, Taiwan is actually an island incredibly difficult to conquer. It is very difficult for landing. There's only 2 windows in a year that you can cross the strait, and it will be a really difficult mission for the Chinese army to just crack it. So I think like the idea that they can go in any time at their will and taking Taiwan at ease. Like a big part of that is actually information warfare to just convince people it is not like a sort of conflict that Taiwan has any chance to sustain or has any chance to sort of like defend themselves. And I think that that's not true. And in the state of economy, in the state of the politics, the purge, and also China has been putting so much effort in just portraying themselves as peacemaker, deal makers in between different powers. It is not a good window for them to go into active war with Taiwan.
What links are there between Taiwanese domestic activists who are against joining China and against any kind of invasion and the former Hong Kong democracy protest movement? I mean, I know some people, ended up in Taipei, didn't they? I mean, I met some of them a couple of years ago, and they were sort of veterans like you of the Hong Kong resistance.
I think like maintaining Taiwan as it is a self-governing political entity is an overwhelming consensus of Taiwanese people, and any action that are trying to oppose or revoke that sort of reality is a big intrusion to their rights. That definitely has a lot of similarity to what Hong Kong people wanted, which is a self-governing district, self-governing city. But sadly, I think with the rise of Xi Jinping, with the rise of his path confidence, cultural confidence, all sort of confidence that he encoded in the party playbook and in the constitutions, there is just no room for any sort of open society, political diversity, freedom of speech, or even universal suffrage in its own realm of influence. And I think if we continue to fall in line by portraying the issue of China and Taiwan is a matter of Chinese internal affairs, that sort of like fall into the narrative of Xi Jinping, and there is no room for the other countries to be part of that conversation. But in fact, this shouldn't be the case. Like, there are many countries that has a stake in that conversation.
But when we look at the impact of the war in Iran and the economic impact globally of the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, what does that tell us about what the world's view of a blockade around Taiwan might be? I mean, that would be economically disastrous. I think people haven't really kind of absorbed the economic impact globally of stopping electronics coming out of Taiwan on the world economy.
Yeah, what we've seen in the Strait of Hormuz is a textbook example of a global choke point actually being choked. And then what happens? We all feel it. You know, the price of everything goes up, the price of energy has gone up, and a war that Trump started, he can't quite finish because the opposition, although Trump can legitimately say we've destroyed their air force and we've destroyed this and that and we've decapitated their leadership, they're still there. So, as far as the Chinese are concerned, that gives them pause for thought, doesn't it, about how they deal with Taiwan going forward and the importance of those microchips from Taiwan reaching the rest of the global economy.
What about Iran itself and the Strait of Hormuz? I mean, obviously that was China's route to buying the vast majority of oil that was being exported from Iran, and that has stopped.
Well, it was 13% of China's supply of oil, so it wasn't as important as it is to some other countries. I think not only is China feeling the effects of an economy that was already slower than what Chinese consumers had been used to, but it's also been a blow for Chinese diplomacy. It was only 3 years ago that China negotiated the restoration of diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It was a really big win for China on the world stage, and now it's in tatters. And the Americans were very worried that the Chinese were kind of suddenly being Mr. Negotiator. But it's what happens when you have a US president who tends to lose interest in things or tends to move on from trying to solve one conflict to the next. And I think the Chinese would like to see themselves as having an opportunity there, which is that in that particular case in the Gulf has been snatched away from them. But that said, the Chinese have never criticized Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So they can't have it both ways. They can't be a global policeman and yet continue with what they have, which is a consistent theme of ideological opposition to the West.
Would the Chinese have told Trump that we want you to lift your blockade on Iran? Or would they, a lot of the speculation in advance was that they won't want to look like they're hurting?
They won't want to look like they're hurting, and similarly, Trump won't want to look like he's gone to Beijing to ask the Chinese to intervene. So quite tellingly, just before Trump left Washington, he said we don't need China's help in solving Iran. In fact, he does. He needs the help of as many countries as he can get.
So this was two great powers who are both in great pain, putting on brave faces.
Yes, I think that's right. And, who was supplicating whom? So what you had was a bit of a score draw between two world leaders who were seen to be getting along. And one thing we should remember is that I think there are another 3 meetings between the two men planned. So the good news, I think, for the global economy is that they're going to carry on talking. So President Trump has invited Xi to Washington at the end of September. Chinese have accepted. So I think the good news is in a very volatile world, these two men are talking and they're going to carry on talking, which can only be a good thing.
Does that fill you and your colleagues with great dismay? That Xi gets lauded like this and invited to Washington and told he's a great man?
There was a time when we thought about dealing with dictators, dealing with people who commit a lot of crimes against humanities, that we have to deal with care because rolling red carpet for them could probably, in one way or another, feeling like we are not sort of recognizing its bad behaviors in the country, and everything that we care is about interest, is about money. And the discussion about values, the discussion about democracy fade away in terms of realpolitik. And I think this is exactly the situation that we are in. President Trump is not someone who would uphold certain values and then saying that we are gonna sort of like protect that even at the cost of certain national interests. Like everything from him and his line of politics is about being America first. And I think that has posed certain worries for people who care about the state of democracy around the world.
But do you think there is do you think there are things that are at stake for Western democracies that we don't seem to recognize in our treatment of people like the Chinese president, and just forgetting about human rights and democracy and all of those things and saying we need a trading relationship now, the world economy is more important?
There are two parallel that are happening in global politics. Dictators are becoming more united. You've got a new terms of like access of dictators just coined a couple months ago when leaders from China, from Russia, from North Korea, from Iran, like they were sitting together. And then you've got another parallel that's ongoing. Democracies are sort of like a little bit like becoming less united. Like there are many democratic countries that are flaming against each other along different issues, different lines of things. And I think this is something that as a political activist who are advocating democratic rights for people in Hong Kong, in China, and around the world, that we are stuck in a very difficult situation because we are seeing all these dictators that they're getting help from each other. And while we are trying to hold them accountable for their bad behaviors, seemingly we don't get as much support and as much help from allies that we used to think that they are standing behind, that they're standing behind us, that we're working together. But for now, that sort of support has faded. So I think it is a big issue for us.
I suppose what I'm getting at as well, though, beyond that, is if you talk about dictators, by which I guess you mean Xi and Putin,
Yeah.
Being cozied up to by a great power leader like Trump, is there something about our democracies that is also being weakened by this?
It's very difficult for us to be in that situation where we advocate for democratic rights, democracy, and we try to look at elsewhere by providing example. They're doing amazingly with the sort of rights, and we try to look there, and there's no one. And that gives us a difficult spot to just try to validate why we have to put up so much effort in trying to fight for these rights when there aren't many good examples that we can refer to in nowadays. So I think...
Does that include Britain? You don't see Britain as a democratic example anymore?
Of course, like it is a great example of democratic countries that we just got some of the cases about the Chinese spies in the UK that the UK government has taken really strong stance and find them out and then warn against these intrusion of national security and also personal safety of my fellows. And the UK is still a very strong democracy. But the state of global democracy, we're in a backsliding for more than 2 decades. And then you've got a big division, you've got economy is not doing well, and then you have a lot of sort of like democratic countries going against each other along many different lines and many different things. So I would say that there are definitely democratic countries that they are operating well, but it's less and less common. And
I mean, do you mean America? You know, and it is the problem that when American democracy appears weak,
America is definitely
pro-democracy activists around the world lose their beacon.
It's definitely one of the examples that we look up to, but not, of course, like not limited to that. And there are lots of human rights efforts around the world that are also supported by the sort of infrastructure that the US and provides. So I think that's definitely not an easy years from the workers that are really on the ground.
And I think the same thing is happening militarily. So, the Japanese, really close allies of the Americans for decades now, looking at Trump prevaricating over Taiwan and thinking, well, what's happening to the military alliance, which is not just NATO, it's much bigger than that, about what happens if China does take military action. Look at the British, who, sent one of their 2 aircraft carriers to the Pacific precisely to send a message that, we stand with the Japanese and the Australians in, protecting seaways around the Strait of Taiwan and off the Philippines as well. So, we saw it first in Ukraine. We saw Trump appearing to side with Vladimir Putin, saying to Vladimir Zelensky, you don't hold all the cards, belittling him, at one point removing intelligence cooperation. And so there's this massive degree of mistrust and sort of rethinking about, what do we, where is America in all this? Can we rely on them? And a big question mark this week is over Taiwan.
You mentioned the Chinese spies case here in Britain. Now, obviously, you're on the Chinese list, if you like. I mean, what does that mean for your daily life?
I have to be more vigilant than ordinary people because there is a bounty on my head. I'm on the wanted list. That's one thing that really concerned me the most is when we had this trial on the Hong Kong ETO case, where they have a staff working for the ETO and also a staff working for the border control of the UK, that they both committed this surveillance. And there was a piece of evidence in the court saying that the border staff is using his own computer to have access to information to people like me. It was, for me, it's definitely quite shocking because I can be vigilant on the street to make sure no one follows me. I can be good at internet security, digital security, so that I don't leave internet footprint that can expose my personal details. But there are certain things I have to provide to the government. If there are government insiders, they can easily access my information, for example, my whereabouts. That would put me in a sort of a fragile situation.
Just explain the ETO.
Yeah, the Hong Kong Economic Trade Office, which is the representative office of Hong Kong government in the UK. So they were involved in a case, in a national security law case in the UK, where they sort of order some surveillance and following the Hong Kong distance in the UK.
How far do you think it goes? I mean, when you say there's a bounty on your head, and they may be surveilling you, do you actually fear for your life?
In terms of how aggressive that the Chinese government trying to harm overseas activists is definitely less aggressive than the Russian one. We've got the Navalny case, which everyone knows that the Russian authority was behind it. My concern for my personal safety is not that immense to that degree that I'm not worrying about my life. But yeah, it goes with a lot of restriction in terms of where you go, in terms of how public you can be. I try to live a relatively low-profile life. For example, I am a bit worried when I engage with people who I don't know, strangers, not sure what their intentions are. And that was definitely an effect to try to isolate you, atomize you, that people who you used to know, especially those who live in Hong Kong, that they cut off connection with you just because of the worry of secondary impact to them. So I would say that the impact is much more about psychological and try to isolate you as a human being, as an individual, and just make you worry about, your personal information being exposed.
What do you think about the anti-China political sort of alliance here in Parliament and the warnings that they make about Chinese threats to Britain. Do you think they're right when they portray China as not just a strategic threat, but an actual threat to Britain and British infrastructure?
I always say that most people who are critical to China is actually not anti-China. Most of us, we love the people. We're not against the country, but the regime itself, and the regime is stated very clearly that they are going to, promote their authoritarianism, to ask for their nationals, especially Chinese nationals, where they have sort of relationship with, to work for them, and they have intelligence laws written to guarantee that if they want a certain piece of information from you as a Chinese nationals, you have to comply. Otherwise, you will be violating the intelligence law. I think like all these combined with the sort of aggressive behaviors of Chinese government overseas, that is indeed a big concern, especially when they try to buy like sensitive industry in the UK, and the mega Chinese embassy discussion that they have a sort of capacity to do more surveillance and intelligence work. I think these are really legitimate concerns and worries.
And do you think that the British government's sort of toning down of its rhetoric when it comes to China is a mistake?
For many exile activists from Hong Kong and from China living in the UK, we are indeed feeling these sort of warming up of the UK-China relationship may result in a compromise of their stance towards the human rights issue in Hong Kong, and whether they are as active to protect and help the Hong Kong BNO immigrants in the UK. And I would say that all the threats have not been stopped. We are still worried about whether we criticize the Hong Kong government and families back in Hong Kong, their doors are being knocked. And we've seen people who are critical towards the Hong Kong government, when they travel back to Hong Kong from other countries, they get locked up, they get jailed just because of their speech. So I would say that there is a worry about whether the UK government would sort of like make any form of compromise of our own safety, and how much that they would try to hold the Hong Kong government accountable on these bases.
And Jonathan, I mean, is Britain basically aligned with the American position, or is there a difference?
I think there's a difference of quite considerable degree. Keir Starmer was in Beijing quite recently, and you get the standard British line, which is we always raise the issue of human rights. And I'm sure that they do, but the question is, how quickly do they move on to issues of trade and indeed regional stability, and the question of Taiwan as well. So, I think the British would not wish to be seen in the same boat as the Americans. But
what do you mean by that? Sorry, do you mean that they don't want to be threatening war, or they don't want to be cozying up on trade?
I think that a Labour government would wish to put clear water between itself and the Americans on the issue of human rights. But it is a question of degree. And as those of us who remember when Robin Cook was a Labour Foreign Secretary, 25, 30 years ago, human rights was way up the agenda, and it has just come down. And I think having the most powerful man in the world being Donald Trump has an effect on all of us. It has changed the level of debate when it comes to human rights.
We must leave it there. Nathan Law, thank you very much indeed. Jonathan, thank you. That's the Forecast. Until next time, bye-bye.